The organizers asked me to speak on federalism and energy transition in India, and I think it's a very vast topic to capture in 20 minutes discussion. I'm going to focus on a much narrower question. Do we need federalism for energy transition? I'll try to answer that question with my short presentation. So, to answer that question, we need to understand the origin of this federal arrangement in power sector and how it has evolved over the decades and what has been the implication and how it interacts with the energy transition. We'll come to that afterwards. So, let me start with the origin. At the time of independence, the constitution makers of India chose to go for put electricity into the concurrent list, which meant both center and the state governments will have shared jurisdiction over the sector, and that decision was driven by various factors. I mean, largely because the regional diversity, not just in terms of economic diversity, but also diversity in electrical development. At the time of independence, we had a very nascent sector, which was confined to few provinces. So it became important for some national level coordination so that we have equitable electrical development across the states. The second factor, which was sort of a global wisdom, was to tap economies of scale by having large electrical projects, large hydro dams, and large thermal power plants, which will bring down the cost of electricity and increase access to people. So the third factor which got debated in the Constituent Assembly was electricity duty as a source of public finance. So even the nascent sector, which was confined to few provinces, in those provinces, the duty collected from sale of electricity was, by duty, I mean the tax imposed on electricity sales, provided a sizable portion of public finance. So which made those provinces to demand for some degree of state control. So as a result, we had an arrangement where the states got more responsibility in terms of electrical development and managing the electricity demands that came from citizens. And center sort of wielded control over planning oversight. And eventually, that arrangement led to certain consolidation, certain structures in this power sharing, which is described or which is seen as a seesaw relationship of control on certain aspects. State governments wielding more control on other aspects, central getting more control. So, to give some context, at state level, the priority eventually, as electricity became a electoral commodity or through 70s and 80s particularly, the priority shifted towards managing electricity demands. Who gets access at what cost? That dominated the state level policy priority. Rather than focusing on electrical developments, adding capacity, network, all those things. I mean, that was not able to keep pace with the electricity demand. So there was a natural shift from electricity being a growth enabler to electricity as a means of welfare, and state electricity boards become agents of redistribution. So as we know, cross subsidy as it exists now, that originated in 70s and 80s, got consolidated over decades. So, and in the process, because electricity becomes so vital to electoral politics, states' approach to electrical development remained much more narrow, and they tried to create a state specific electricity islands. Like the grid was expanded within the state without any aspiration to integrating across the states. Similarly, at the central level, as I said, because electrical development could not keep pace with demands, center came with a lending hand in 70s by getting into generation. So as we know, NHPC and TPC came into formed in 1970s to supplement states' capacity addition interventions. And similarly, as central capacity came in, transmission became also important. The second important thing that happened in 70s again was coal nationalization. So where central government had a control over the fuel source, the key fuel source that powered the electricity sector. And the third vital resource which central gained more control in this eventually was public capital that was required for electrical development. It was not only the budgetary allocations where power sector got a larger share, which came from the center, but simultaneously center also created uh, financial institutions for financing power sector development like PFC, REC came into position. And at the same time, nationalization of banks also provided power to the center over capital investment in the sector. So, the outcome of this by early 90s, we know, the crisis in the power sector, and then we, and as a solution, there was center designed a structural reform package for the states. And again, at this point, this reform structure was driven by the global trend of unbundling and sort of encouraging private participation in the sector. The focus was on remaking the governance, and a special emphasis was placed on delinking politics from politics at state level from electricity decisions, and promote private sector participation, competition, and choice for the consumers. And we all know about what has been the experience of these reforms, which spread over 2.5 decades. Uh, Ironically, the configuration of technology, institutions, and politics has remained stubbornly persistent. So even though we had unbundling, the new institutional structure, the DISCOM sort of inherited the obligations of welfareism, and the technological gigantism survived, rather became bigger, and the institutional control sort of remained the same. And the outcome, despite all these interventions, all these years of interventions and intent to reform the sector, the outcome has been a low level equilibrium, but which is stable so far. So eventually, we have entered into an era where, which I would call federalism skepticism. So, and where there is a growing, emerging consensus that states have failed to perform, and states had failed to achieve the reform objectives. That is an outcome of lack of political will at the state level and that lack of capacity as well. So, what is the solution? There is a greater emphasis on transferring the responsibilities to the center. And we see in the last few years, we have seen an increasing tendency towards centralizing in the decision-making process. And this federalism skepticism in power sector is not happening in silos. It's a reflection of larger political paradigm as well. When I have this opinion piece from Professor Mehta, which came out yesterday, which rightly point out it's not just about the power bargain between center and state, but it's a mishappenings in federalism is a co-production by the political culture in state and center both. And the ongoing current energy transition is happening under this skepticism. So, uh, uh, and under the assumption that states have limited capacity and center has to play a bigger role. So to understand that, let's try to understand what the transition entails. So the transition, energy transition uh, itself pose challenges to the current institutional arrangement we have around power sector. So it is going to cause disruptions in the institutional and political arrangement we have so far. So first, whether we may disagree on the timeline and pace of this transition, but there is the dependency on coal in power sector is going to reduce. And in fact, last session discussed about it. So I'm not going into the timeline or at what pace it will happen, but eventually the reliance on coal will go down. So that reduces centers' control over a vital resource. And simultaneously, we are seeing, which SEMFA has also published in several round of studies, there is some degree of delinking from the public capital in the sector. More the investment coming for clean energy technologies are largely coming from external financial sources than from public sector banks. So eventually, the dependency on public capital will go down. And simultaneously, we are also going to see further unbundling in the sector. By unbundling, I don't mean the 90s kind of unbundling, but rather consumers becoming prosumers and the need for larger integration across state boundaries. So that will require further fragmentation as well as integration in the sector. So which eventually will lead to uh, unviability of the current redistribution model, which is happening, as it has been published by several studies and particularly by prior study on how the current model of discoms is unviable in coming future, as RE makes it convenient for consumers to shift to standalone systems and migrate away from the grid. So that while these disruptions are imminent, we need to rethink the configuration so that we can achieve justice and equity at the core of this transition. But unfortunately, the priority at government level seems to be preserving public power. By public power, I mean government control over the sector transition. So as we see, even in the RE promotion, there is a greater emphasis on gigantism. So it has been discussed in the last panel again, but the focus is on having large scale RE as opposed to decentralized or small scale RE. And there is a simultaneous emphasis on institutional stability, maintaining the current structure of institutions and institutional control. Which is evident in various measures taken. And the third aspect, which is a predictable planning. While we are heading towards uncertain future, where both demand as well as the supply side of the electricity sector is becoming much more unpredictable, we don't factor in those risks and uncertainties in our planning process. And the fourth aspect I would emphasize is, even though there is a reduced reliance on public capital, but much of the private capital is coming with state guarantees. So it's a state-backed capital. So where state is trying to still retain some control. So that's the trajectory we have seen so far. And let's see what are the key trends in this transition process. Um, so over last 2 decades, and particularly in the last 1 decade, we have seen states as laboratories of policy innovations. There has been significant development at the state level first, which has been diffused both horizontally and vertically. So just to give some examples, um, uh, let's talk about solarization of irrigation, which started as a state level experiment, and eventually it has become a national scheme which is going to be implemented across the states. And similarly, A recent amendment to the ultra mega solar park scheme, which is launched by Center, which is run by Center, that allows some facilitation charge to the states, and that's a experiment which was tried in Rajasthan first. Then now it's part of the central scheme, and I mean, it's probably a substitute for what was coal royalty, could be a solar royalty for the states going for ultra mega solar parks. And similarly, I mean, the states have provided test beds for various business models, various contracting models for RE promotion. So it's a valuable aspect of having multi-level governance in the sector. So that provides multiple entry points for policy innovations. Uh, that's the positive side. The other side of story is, uh, despite that positive aspects, we have seen an uneven transition across states, and it's a reflection of regional economic diversity and weak state capacity. So, I mean, in the clean energy sector, we are seeing there are some leader states and there are some laggard states. States which are going for more RE are often rich, have higher economic capacity, and also there are other factors like political economy factors like access to coal or access to transmission facility. Those has also played role. But what we are currently seeing, it's an uneven pattern of transition, not all states doing equally. And the other third pattern, third trend, which I want to discuss is greater central imposition for the transition. So, I mean, with the at the beginning, a center played a more signaling role, and by providing incentives to actors and players in the transition. But eventually, that role was consolidated by to handholding. In the mid of this decade, we saw central agencies coming in, contracting RE capacity, which provided better guarantee, better market price. But that has eventually led to a phase where there is some degree of imposition from the center. So, in way of targets, regulations, and standards, it's much more centrally designed and imposed on the state. So, the fear is coercion, such form of coercion may provoke resistance from the states, or as we experienced in case of the reforms, it could lead to compromised compliance. So in that context, rather than going into specifics more, uh, uh, let me get back to the question I asked first. Do we need federalism for energy transition, or that's not a necessity? My answer is we need more federalism. And by more federalism, that doesn't mean a reduced role for centers. It's rather realigning the responsibilities. And I think for energy transition, center has to play greater roles, but different roles. First, we need an ecosystem. So which the center can play a key role in providing that, and providing better coordination across the stakeholders and the states. Uh, Next is because of the variability nature of clean energy RE, we need a larger grid integration and more transmission capacities, which center can only provide because it falls into central jurisdiction. And finally, which has recently picked up, but in a very different context, but center needs to promote technology innovation and manufacturing. Uh, that should be the priority at the central level, while at state level, the focus should be uh, on working on with the states rather than imposing trajectory on the state. The focus should be designing state-specific approach to transition, which considers the local political culture, local political economy aspects, and engage with local political opportunities and costs at state level. Uh, and more importantly, electricity has been playing a role in redistribution, and those redistributive demands remain in Indian economy and society, uh, and at different levels, both across the states as well as within states, different consumer categories. And we need to engage more with those redistributive demands. And the priority should be fixing the state capacity and processes rather than transferring the responsibilities.